Whether halal or haram, I couldn't have experienced ayahuasca as anything other than a Muslim, embarking on an entirely Muslim trip. The chemical purging and healing found their expression through the symbolic language of Islam, or at least an archive of stories and reference points in my brain that I've cataloged as Islam. Whether this pushed me out of Islam or drilled me straight into its deepest guts, I can't say, but that is an old problem of mystical experience.
Why I Am a Salafi can be thought of as an unofficial sequel to Tripping with Allah, because the story picks up right where this one leaves off. And it starts off focusing in on a trip to the mosque to pray that the author takes the morning after his transformative ayahuasca experience. His experience of prayer that morning opens up a pivotal reflection on the physicality of religious practice. Even though his head is emptied of linguistic inner dialogue by a peak white-knuckle psychedelic experience the night before, his tongue still repeats Quranic recitations, and his body still moves, according to the prayer inscribed on his limbs through years of repetition. His mind is in a state of flux, but the somatic power of Islamic rituals, from ablution to salat, anchor him in his faith and connect it directly to an embodiment of spirituality that transcends language altogether. These physical acts of worship are not just routines, they are profound expressions of submission, allowing him to rehearse a connection with the divine on a tactile, visceral level. This theme of bodily engagement with the religion sets the tone for the entire book, contrasting sharply with more textual approaches to faith that come from engaging with hadith, the Quran, and other secondary Islamic scholarship as scriptural and intellectual traditions. This leads him to a decidedly sober reflection and analysis of how his body was ever equipped with the physical lexicon of this prayer, and how exactly both the bodily and cerebral aspects of Islam entered his life in the first place. Michael Muhammad Knight then retraces his whole journey into Islam, revealing how a diverse range of influences shaped the kind of Muslim he became. It wasn't just about adopting a new religion, but about taking on a whole new identity, a process that was shaped by the literature, music, and socio-political environment of 1990s America. For Why I Am a Salafi, Knight goes back and rereads every single source that first guided him, including outsider influences like the teachings of the Five Percenters, the lyrics of Public Enemy, a biography of Ayatollah Khomeini, and most of all, the autobiography of Malcolm X. These were all combined with a Yusuf Ali Quran translation and various Saudi-sponsored literature that he initially accepted at face value as a coherent and straightforward vision of Islam. And when he traveled to live for a while at a mosque in Pakistan, he didn't think of it as Salafi or Saudi, but simply as a place where he could deepen his understanding of the religion. Later on, after returning to the USA, he would discover that the mosque he frequented in Pittsburgh was referred to as a hotbed of Salafism. But at the time, he didn't recognize it as a particular stream of Islam. It was just Islam, and he was just a Muslim. Through these reflections on the sources that made Knight the specific type of Muslim he became as a teenager, he underscores that however us converts come to Islam, no one comes to it in a neutral way. And no form of Islam that we encounter is neutral, pure, or without its own origin story. Knight's journey illustrates that we all arrive at Islam inflected by our personality, our cultures, and our backgrounds. And whatever version of Islam that we encounter will itself be inflected by centuries of human experience, interpretation, culture, and history. So we are, in a sense, a mixture meeting a mixture.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree?
Even sticking as closely as possible to the Quran and Hadith requires going through the mediation of scholars and other human beings, each with their own histories and developments. In Michael Muhammad Knight's case, he came to learn that the real history of Islam, even among the age of the first 3 generations, was much more complicated than the cohesive vision presented by the simplistic pamphlets made it out to be, and this created a kind of heartbreak.
What I call my Salafi phase ended badly, in part because of my disillusionment with the Golden Age. Every Golden Age is imagined by people who come long after that age and is made possible only by editing, erasing, rewriting, and creatively interpreting communal memory. Golden Ages are sanitized imaginaries of messy realities and generally fail to survive closer scrutiny. When I started to ask the wrong questions and Islam's sacred past became more complicated for me, that is, when I learned that my authoritative heroes fought and killed each other in civil wars, the whole edifice came crashing down.
Ultimately, this recognition didn't diminish his faith, but rather it added layers of meaning and depth to a lifelong spiritual journey. However, this journey ended up being a pretty bumpy ride of deconstruction and reconstruction, coming to involve a much broader set of Islamic scholarship that went far beyond pamphlets. For me, plant medicines were part of a long journey of spiritual seeking that eventually led me to Islam. And since then, the journey has continued, but it's continued through the Quran and Hadith and learning about centuries of Islamic scholarship. So it's almost like I was seeking for Islam, and since then I've been seeking through Islam. And I've even joked that if you want a real psychedelic experience, just give Shahada. Now that's the trip of a lifetime, buddy. And it's a trip that'll take you through metaphysics, angels, jinn, heaven, hell, virtue ethics, mystical experiences, a relationship with the divine, and indeed a relationship with yourself and getting to know your psyche, your innermost wants, fears, and desires. And it's all underpinned by a heroic quest to polish your heart until eventually, inshallah, it's gleaming like a diamond and you're truly close to the divine. And this, of course, is the quest we call the Greater Jihad. Just like he retraces his own Salafi roots, Knight goes on to trace the roots of Salafism itself, focusing on key figures who are often regarded as the intellectual forebears of the movement. Ahmed ibn Hanbal, the founder of the Hanbali school of thought, was known for his unwavering commitment to the Quran, Hadith, and opinions of the Prophet and his companions as the sole sources of Islamic law, resisting the influence of rationalist Mu'tazilite interpretations and philosophical reasoning. His insistence on strict adherence to the practices of the earliest Muslims, the Salaf, laid the groundwork for what would later be known as Salafi thought. Despite his current status as a pillar of Orthodox Sunni Islam, Ahmed ibn Hanbal was a little bit of a controversial figure in his time, facing imprisonment and persecution for his views during the Mihna, a period of religious inquisition under the Abbasid Caliphate. Ibn Taymiyyah, a scholar who lived several centuries after Ahmed ibn Hanbal, expounded on many similar ideas. His work featured a staunch opposition to practices and beliefs that he viewed as innovations or bid'ah within Islam, advocating instead for a return to what he believed were the pure teachings of the Quran and Sunnah as practiced by the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. His critiques extended to much of Sufism, philosophy, and the veneration of saints, all of which he saw as deviations from true Islam. Like Ibn Hanbal, Ibn Taymiyyah was a polarizing figure, facing opposition and even imprisonment for his views. He is actually much more popular now than he was in his own time. The development of what would come to be known as Salafi thought continued through the influence of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Abdul Wahhab's teachings, which sought to restore pure monotheism and purge Islam of what he viewed as idolatrous practices, became closely associated with the political rise of the Saudi state. The alliance between Abdul Wahhab's followers and the House of Saud was instrumental in spreading Salafi thought globally, as Saudi Arabia's oil wealth and political power enabled the dissemination of a particular type of Salafi ideology far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. Knight basically argues that the Salafi claim to a timeless and unchanging Islam is itself something that emerged historically with its own complex origin story. So the Salafi claim to purity and authenticity was in fact a response to what its scholars and followers saw as a corruption in set of innovations that had crept into the religion over time. By exploring these historical figures and going much deeper into other cultural exchanges between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Knight reveals that what we refer to as Salafism, or more pejoratively, Wahhabism, is a particular historical movement with its own roots in certain political and religious dynamics of the pre-modern and modern era. A central theme in Knight's exploration of Salafism involves using its own logic in a quest to return to the pure origins of Islam as lived, taught, and practiced by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions. So naturally, this also involves a very, very close look at the Quran and the Hadith, which are generally regarded as the two primary sources of Islamic knowledge. The process of compiling both the Quran and Hadith were far more complex than often acknowledged, involving significant human effort and historical contingencies. Regarding the Quran, Knight discusses in detail the history of its compilation, which involved disagreements among the Prophet's companions and debates over the inclusion of different verses. While we have direct physical evidence of revealed verses going right back to the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the project to compile the entire Quran as a whole was initiated during the Caliphate of Abu Bakr. This was after numerous Quran reciters had been killed in battle and motivated by a fear of losing the Quranic material altogether. Later on, when the Quran was standardized under Uthman, all other copies were destroyed. So the point here is not to undermine or question the authenticity of the Quran in any way, but merely to point out that it was human beings tasked with compiling it together, and that this was a socially mediated process that happened over time. Knight notes that the science of hadith evaluation did not develop until several generations after the Prophet, let alone become second to the Quran in orthodox importance. The early scholars like Bukhari were operating in response to an environment where fabricated hadiths were widespread. This led to the rigorous methods of cross-referencing transmitters' reliability, but these methods also reflect the biases and social dynamics of those involved. Bukhari himself led a somewhat colorful life, traveling very extensively in search of a hadith. But neither his work nor the work of other early hadith collectors was immediately accepted by all, only becoming central canon eventually. So, where Bukhari is now synonymous with authenticity and purely transmitted tradition, Knight points out that there was a time in history before this was the case, and a process whereby it became a reality, a process that involved many different people. Even Quran-only Muslims, who attempt to go straight to the word of Allah and disregard the whole hadith tradition, still must involve human scholars for reasons of tafsir, equivocal verses, and verses that were revealed in certain historical contexts addressing certain historical situations. This is, of course, to say nothing about translations of the Quran into other languages. Knight argues that the idea of a pure, eternal Islam, which is more or less core to the Salafi project, is itself a construct, shaped by centuries of debate, disagreement, and the inevitable imprint left by those who transmitted these traditions, even when their genuine intention was simply to preserve them faithfully. The transmitter, no matter how faithful, always leaves some type of fingerprint on the tradition, whether through their selection of material, their interpretation, the context in which they transmit it, or the material that, for one reason or another, does not get transmitted. And beyond any of that, Islam emerged in dialogue with Christianity, Judaism, and polytheism. Quranic verses often commented directly on what the companions were going through out in the world, and all the original companions were converts with their own non-Muslim histories prior to accepting Islam. And again, this is not to undermine the Quran or the Hadith or the religion or its scholars in any way. In fact, it ought to build appreciation for the amazing people who have transmitted this tradition. It's just to point out that human beings have been involved at every step of the way, engaged with one another in dynamic and even sometimes dramatic social situations. In fact, the Islam that we take for granted as just Islam today is in many ways the product of these social engagements, themselves in the context of various historical forces and all types of other contexts that affected how the religion has been transmitted. Therefore, what the author's kind of saying is that even if a pure, uncorrupted Islam exists somewhere in time and space, for us to access this in a pure and direct, unmediated way is essentially impossible. Knight examines the blurred boundaries between orthodoxy and the margin in Islamic history. He points out that many figures who are now often celebrated as heroes of mainstream canonical Islam, including Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Hanbal, were once marginalized or even persecuted for their views. This theme replaces the notion of a monolithic, unchanging orthodoxy in Islam with something far more dynamic. Knight argues that what is considered orthodoxy today was often born out of struggles on the margins, where new ideas were tested and eventually accepted into the mainstream. This fluidity calls into question the rigid nature with which some contemporary Muslims approach the concept of orthodoxy.
If we wanted to glorify Muslim history's rebels and misfits as our answer to all of Salafism's problems, our counter-tradition would have to include the same people who give modern Salafism its foundation. In certain times and places, figures such as Ibn Hanbal, Bukhari, and Ibn Taymiyyah were all seen as heretics and subjected to persecution. On the other side, Sufism, which we like to romanticize for what we perceive as its valorization of individual spirituality and resistance to the legalistic Islam of modern state power, has often enjoyed greater social and economic privilege with imperial regimes than the traditions of the Hadith folk.
As a convert to the religion, I found this really interesting myself. All four of the Sunni madhab eponyms, the major ones anyway, were political prisoners, including Ibn Hanbal. And in Islamic history, you have this very interesting theme of the orthodoxy and the margins, or the heretics and the rebels and the outsiders. But it's so interesting precisely because when you really look at the boundaries between those two categories, they seem to just get blurrier and blurrier. In some cases, as with Ibn Taymiyyah, people are only canonized after their death, becoming the mainstream only kind of later on. And in some other cases, the debate continues to rage whether people are part of the margins or part of the orthodoxy. For example, someone like Ibn Arabi is either Sheikh al-Akbar, the greatest sheikh, or a heretic who placed himself outside the fold of Islam by virtue of his ideas, depending on who you ask. Another good example might be Rumi, who is alternately conceived as the most famous and influential Muslim writer of all time, or a radical Sufi poet who was peripheral to the mainstream development of the religion, again, depending on who you ask or how you see it. Borrowing from Deleuze and Guattari, Knight introduces the metaphor of a tree versus a rhizome to describe different ways of understanding the structure of inherited Islamic tradition. The tree represents a linear, hierarchical view of Islam where knowledge and authority are passed down through clearly defined lineages. In contrast, the rhizome represents a decentralized root structure where Islamic knowledge and practice spread in various directions without a single unifying authority. Knight advocates for the rhizome model as a more accurate reflection of the diverse and dynamic nature of Islam, at least as he and many others experience it. This perspective allows for a more inclusive understanding of the religion, acknowledging the lateral and decentered connections through which Muslims have shared and transmitted their faith throughout history. You know, I think a good real-world example of this can be found in social media. If you scroll down my social media feeds, you will see Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, Dr. Bilal Ware, Mustafa Briggs, Abdul Hakim Murad, Yahya Rodas, Aisha Prime, Yasmin Mujahid, Ubaidullah Evans, Amina Wadud, Omid Safi, Habibu Omar, Michael Muhammad Knight, and many, many, many more. So, do these people all come from the same lineage? Absolutely not. Do they agree on everything? Absolutely not. But They're all examples of influences on my proverbial bookshelf and part of my decentralized rhizomatic network, informing and in a sense creating the vision of Islam that I have and understand. This was a pretty different list 4 years ago when I was on the verge of giving Shahada, and I assume it'll be at least somewhat different in 4 years from now, and I will be a different person encountering and engaging with these influences differently. In the final sections of the book, Knight brings the discussion of blurry boundaries in Islamic history to a culmination with discussion of his body as a contact zone, the location where a plurality of Islamic influences swirl together, encountering within him his own personal subjectivity. Mixtures meet and mix with other mixtures, and crosstalk within the contact zone never stops or finds clear resolution. It's worth pointing out that the central project of this book is not some kind of deconstructive nihilism, but actually comes from a deep place of caring about the religion. And this all finds an anchor point in reflection on the importance of community in Islam. It's community and communal worship that brings the bodies of disparate individuals and viewpoints together, even if they don't all share the same rhizomatic networks, opinions about history, or perspectives on theology. So whether or not his views on ayahuasca or hadith compilation are shared, and he's resigned to the fact that they generally won't be, the format of the religion as a shared reality that we all co-create makes possible the social and communal spiritual experience that unites us, and that is a very real thing. In particular, the author recognizes that the shared physical practices of Islam, such as prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage, create a lived unity among Muslims, regardless of their individual beliefs or interpretations. This theme of bodily engagement with religion, coupled with a deep appreciation for the diversity within the Muslim community, brings the book full circle, returning to the physicality that first grounded Knight's post-ayahuasca experience. The body is, of course, not a neutral terrain either, and our conceptions of our bodies is much, much different than it would have been for the companions in pre-modern times. But nevertheless, there really is something about hearing the Quran and praying shoulder to shoulder that has the effect of transcending language and all of its distinct, historically loaded complexities. I love this book, and I have really only scratched the surface in this video of everything it covers and describes. It is extremely knowledgeable, rigorously cited, very professional and academic in tone, while still maintaining a kind of first-person narrative. This is an incredible book. It's 350 pages. It's not super short, but I devoured it in 5 days. I found it to be unput-downable, a real page-turner. And if you watched my review in part 1 of Tripping with Allah, you know that I issued a warning. Okay, remember? I think some of you forgot. I issued a warning about that book. That's how the video ends, is that it's not for everybody. This book, on the other hand, I really would recommend to any Muslim. I think it's fantastic. I think I was a little turned off. The cover didn't really speak to me, and the name didn't really call me my name either. But I am so glad that I read it, and I think that just about anybody would get something out of it. This book asks a lot of questions, and in a sense comes up with answers, even if they're not final, that I asked and wanted answers to. So I found it amazingly comforting in that way, and kind of filled in a lot of gaps for me. The author also narrates having sort of like crises in his development through his religion that I have really lived myself. So it made me feel less crazy, honestly. It made me feel much less alone, because it's stuff that I don't really hear anybody talking about in more kind of mainstream sources, but nevertheless, they come up here in a way that was deeply, deeply resonant for me. Check it out if it sounds like something that you're interested in. Another thing too is that, even though this is kind of like a loving deconstruction or an academic style historiography of Islamic religious traditions, what I really took away from it, I don't know if you'd call this a caveat or kind of pushback on the book, is just how important real lived embodied scholarship is in this religion. When it comes to the kind of backpack of Islamic sources that I mentioned earlier, I think I'm at a point in my life where I would almost happily trade that stuff in for one sheikh who I could really learn the religion from. Because For all of the kind of complication that this adds to the history of our tradition, I think what it inadvertently reinforces is that there is such a thing as purely transmitted knowledge, but it's not necessarily written down. So the book sets up this dichotomy between physical community practice and script and textual analysis. But meanwhile, I still do believe in shuyuk or aliyah that transmit something directly from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to this present day. I just don't think that it's found in books. Honestly, and this was taught to me by someone much smarter and more knowledgeable than me, the real sunnah can't come from hadith. I do believe that. I think that the real sunnah comes from somebody who embodies the sunnah, who can put everything together for you, including hadith, including understanding of the Quran, and including a lived version of the religion, lived version of ethics. So in a sense, what this kind of academic style historiography sort of reinforces for me is just how important and how real the need for that type of embodied transmission really is. That's my 2 cents. I hope you enjoyed the review and the video. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace.
That's not unorthodox.
It isn't unorthodox?
No. I thought it was beautiful. But then there you go.
Oh, but